lot has happened in the last 2 months since we've seen each other. I want to ask you first about fear itself. And you said that in politics, your party was becoming the party of fear. So let's talk about that. What is it that you fear, if anything?
Well, I mean, in that context, somebody asked me when I was at a demonstration, in Germany, and at the beginning of the pandemic, in August of 2020, and there were 1 million people there from all the countries of Germany, and it was like a kind of a Woodstock crowd. It was a very, very diverse crowd, and I was in the crowd shaking hands with thousands of people, and I was not at that time wearing a mask, and almost nobody was. And an NBC film crew were completely masked, approached me at that time, and they said, you're not wearing a mask, aren't you scared of COVID? And I said to them, well, there's things I'm a lot more frightened of than COVID. And they said, like, what? I said, like, my children growing up in an America where there's no constitutional rights. And, it's been recognized forever that fear is a governing tool. And particularly for totalitarian elements, it's always been the most attractive. Fear, hatred, all of these, kind of dark features of human nature can be used, prejudice, tribalism. But fear is the most potent one. And that's why in 1932, when he was inaugurated, Franklin Roosevelt said the only thing that we have to fear is fear itself. And the reason he said that was because at that moment in history, the global depression, this was long before World War II, the global depression was crumbling financial systems and societies across the world. And in Europe, there were fascist regimes that were using fear to abolish constitutional and civil rights. So you had in Spain and Germany and Italy, you had the rise of corporatism and fascism, and in Eastern Europe, you had left-wing totalitarian regimes also using fear. And in our country, people completely at that point lost faith in our economic system. They were putting their money in their mattresses. About a third of Americans felt that the only hope was a communist regime, and about a third were turning toward fascism or following Father Kaufman or Huey Long, which were urging kind of totalitarian solutions. And Franklin Roosevelt said to people, that is the biggest fear, is fear itself, because that will allow it. We will get through this. We will get through it if we be still. But if we allow ourselves to be manipulated by fear, we will lose everything that we value.
Well, one of the things you've written is that fear has been stoked to provoke mass compliance. So is fear itself the biggest issue facing America right now?
I don't know if it's the biggest issue, but it has become weaponized by elements within the technocracy and in the kind of corporate kleptocracy to engineer compliance of Americans with things that most people would not put up with under normal circumstances. The censorship. We all know that it's wrong, that there's never been a time in history when the good guys have been the ones who are censoring people. And so Americans know, innately that that the government is not supposed to censor us. And yet we put up with it. We said, okay, those guys are scaring us and we need to shut them up. And, the Constitution doesn't have a pandemic exception. The First Amendment doesn't have a pandemic exception. And, the Constitution was written for hard times. And by the way, the founding fathers, the framers of the Constitution, knew all about epidemics. There were 2 epidemics during the Revolutionary War. There was a malaria epidemic that decimated the armies of Virginia. There was a smallpox epidemic that brought to a halt the armies of New England at the very time when we had taken Montreal, so Benedict Arnold's army had captured Montreal. But because they were undermanned, because of the smallpox epidemic, they had to withdraw. Otherwise, today, Canada would be part of the United States. And everybody knew that. The framers of the Constitution knew, what had happened, that these illnesses had really injured the American war effort. And then between the end of the Revolution and the ratification of the Bill of Rights, which is about a 9-year period, there were epidemics in every city in our country that killed tens of thousands of people. There were smallpox epidemics, cholera epidemics in Philadelphia, Boston, New York, and cholera epidemics that took tens of thousands of lives. So everybody knew about it, and yet they did not put an epidemic exception in the United States Constitution or any other exception. And, we've been through much worse calamities than COVID-19 during this Civil War. We lost 659,000 troops in action from disease, but troops on both sides. That's the equivalent of about 7,200,000 today. So much bigger, much larger death count than in COVID. But also our country was being torn apart. We almost lost the United States of America. And yet, when President Lincoln tried to suspend habeas corpus, the constitutional right, the court said you can't do that. And he was doing it for good reason. There were people in the cities who were Confederate sympathizers who were saying and doing bad things and inciting riots that threatened our country, that posed an existential threat to America. And Lincoln was trying to address that issue by getting those people, by silencing those people with habeas corpus, by locking them up. And the court said you can't do it. It doesn't matter what the calamity is. The Constitution has to survive through every calamity. So, but if you manipulate people's fear, Americans know these things. But if you manipulate them with fear, people will retreat and will choose a high percentage of people will choose security over, constitutional rights.
My experience is that most people are very afraid. That's what people talk to me about. And they sort of look to some things that we've done with bewilderment and wonder. So what made you the way that you are, such that you're not looking at it the same way that so many other people in your position would? Did something happen to you? Was it a accumulation of your life experiences? Was there an event that brought you to the place that you are, where you're not approaching these things from a position of fear?
I don't know what it is. I just, I have I think a lot is just probably the accumulation of my experience, which dictates that worldview, starting from when I was a little kid, where my father told me, a couple of weeks before he died, when I talked to him, he was talking about government officials, and he said to me, people in authority lie, and he said it, with kind of a sadness in his voice, but my understanding of just living in a democracy is that our job is to maintain a posture of skepticism towards any kind of large aggregations of power. So government officials, corporate officials, we should be skeptical of those things. And then with me, I've spent 40 years suing big polluters, but about 20% of those lawsuits were actually against the government agencies that have become captured by the industry that they're supposed to regulate. So instead of functioning as to protect the public trust and the public welfare, they function as essentially as sock puppets for the industry that they're supposed to regulate. And I found that out the hard way through just through suing them and through encountering.
Has it made you cynical? Has it
well, I would not call myself a cynical person. I'm skeptical. I'm not going to take anything on faith. I'm always going to question things and say, is that really true? if you tell me something, I'm going to say what, I want evidence-based, I want evidence-based medicine. I just want evidence-based world. I don't.
Well, your father said, he said the people in authority lie.
Yeah.
Has it gotten worse? Or has it always been this bad?
I don't think probably human nature has gotten worse, but I think the institutions of our democracy have declined, have eroded. And that includes not only the institutions of government, the regulatory agencies, and the White House and Congress, but also the press, which is a critical institution.
And when did that start happening, or was it linear? Was there an event?
No, I think, what I really saw, the decline in the public agencies like the environmental agencies and the public health agencies really began around 1980. And if you remember, Earth Day happened in 1970. 20 million people came out on the street, the biggest public demonstration in American history, demanding that our politicians, Republicans and Democrats, return to the American people these ancient environmental rights. Before Earth Day, the year before Earth Day, the peregrine falcon went extinct in the east. The Adams peregrine, the most spectacular predatory bird. Lake Erie was declared dead. We had, fires. We had these oil spills that closed all the beaches in California. The Hudson River, or the Cuyahoga River, that year in '69 caught fire and burned with flames that were 8 stories high, and nobody could put it out. And people were, this accumulation of environmental insults drove 20 million people out onto the streets. It was the biggest demonstration in American history, and it scared the political system. Republicans and Democrats got together. Richard Nixon was then president. He created EPA, signed the Clean Air Act, signed the Clean Water Act, and then we passed over the next 11 years 28 major statutes going right up to 1980, the Endangered Species Act, Circular RCRA, all these environmental safe drinking water. And industry was kind of caught off guard. And those statutes were costing them a lot of money. And industry began mobilizing in the late 70s. And by the early 80s, they were in a counterattack mode. And they understood that they needed to get a hold of these regulatory agencies and make them industry friendly. And that process, I watched that process because I was, from 1984, I was, litigating against polluters. I joined the commercial fishermen on the Hudson River and started suing polluters.
And by the way, I used to swim in Croton on Hudson when I was a child in the 90s. Was it cleaned up by then?
No,
Mid-90s?
that may explain some stuff about you, Jay. But it was not clean.
There's a swimming hole near Croton on Hudson, very sandy. I don't know if you know what I'm talking
Yeah,
about.
I've been swimming. In fact, I scuba dived one time the entire length of that river from the Croton Dam all the way to the mouth of the Hudson River. So I've swam in the entire Croton River, and that town was a very important part of the history of the commercial fishermen on the Hudson River. It was one of the enclaves of the commercial fishery, and those are the people that I represented for.
When did it get cleaned up?
40 years. It started. The cleanup started really in the mid 70s. I mean, my group started suing polluters back then, and I joined them then in '84, and we brought 500 lawsuits against Hudson River polluters. And today, the Hudson is the richest waterway in the North Atlantic. It produces more pounds of fish per acre, more biomass per gallon than any other waterway in the Atlantic Ocean or the equator.
So you mentioned the EPA, the administrative agencies like the CIA and the FBI, and your uncle, John F. Kennedy, expressed desire to, quote, splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds, unquote. I myself have been raided by the FBI. I'm one of the few, if not the only journalist in American history to be raided by FBI agents who took my and my colleagues' journalist notes, and the ACLU came to my defense, which is, I think, a good thing. But in terms of these agencies, going back to my question about was it always this bad, J. Edgar Hoover was the head of the FBI 60 years ago. Was it worse back then? Is it as bad? Is it getting worse now? How would you compare present day to when your uncle was president?
You mean with the enforcement agencies?
Yes.
I think it's more insidious today because of the technologies of control. Back then you had really terrible people running the agency, like Alan Dulles and James Jesus Angleton, Frank Wisner, people who were genuinely murderous and felt like there was no, controls on their behavior. And they started Operation Mockingbird at that point, which was an operation to compromise American journalists. So they had about 400 journalists that we know of. Carl Bernstein wrote an article about Mockingbird around 1975 or 76 in Rolling Stone. And at that point, I think there were some 400 editors, journalists, from all the largest publications. The New York Times had been compromised. The Washington Post was basically.
What do you mean by compromised? For people who
they were functioning. The high-level people at those journals were working for the agency or had signed secrecy agreements with those agencies, with the CIA, and at CBS, ABC, NBC, high-level journalists. So today. Today that's going on. After 75, when it all came out, during the Church Committee hearings, the CIA promised that it would no longer compromise American journalists. It continued the program to compromise journalists all over the world, and today the CIA is the biggest funder of journalism in the world.
How about present day?
They fund it through USAID. But in 2016, Obama. There's a provision in the CIA charter that says that the CIA cannot propagandize the American people. President Obama adopted and I think it was through an executive order in 2016, that essentially reopened the door for Operation Mockingbird so that the CIA began once again to propagandize American people.
How are they doing that, President?
Well, I mean, we know that they did it. We've published articles on the CHD website that shows the journals that appear now where high-level intelligence officials are, or people associated with the intelligence industry, are running those journals, like Noah Schlachman, who runs Rolling Stone, and who came from Daily Beast. Daily Beast was run by John Avalon, who has deep ties to the intelligence agencies. But even journals like Smithsonian and National Geographic, Nature, the Washington Post, the New York Times appear to be compromised by the CIA. We know from the Twitter files at both the FBI and CIA were operating portals within the Twitter and Facebook that allowed them to manipulate information and to deplatform people and to silence certain people that they didn't like in the social media. So, but the answer to the big answer to your question is the problem is today that is frightening is that with AI, with artificial intelligence, and with all of these surveillance, like facial recognition systems, the satellite systems that are now, I think we're going to have 415,000 low-altitude satellites, where they can look at every square inch of the Earth at 24 hours a day. They have technology that can look through walls, and just surveillance technology. We're all under surveillance. Your GPS, your cell phone is spying on you. But we're carrying around these devices that are all spying on us, or all have the capacity to spy on us. And of course they are.
To what end?
What?
To what end?
Well, I mean, the thing that's financing most of this is our commercial and mercantile interests. So you start talking. I mean, I'm sure you've had this experience where you say, I need a better mattress. I can't sleep at night. And then 20 minutes later, you get this, a bunch of mattress ads on your cell phone. Well, they're listening to you. And that's kind of innocuous and actually convenient. That they're listening to you and then putting up, solutions
so the
to your
regulatory
problem.
capture.
But the government also is listening to you. And if you're doing something that, if you are doing something that involves dissent or disobedience to government mandates, it's quite possible that there's some government agency that's keeping track of that.
Have you
And that's scary.
Any retaliation in the since the pandemic? Have you seen any overt forms of retaliation against you by the intelligence community?
Well, we don't know. I mean, we don't know because there's always kind of irregularities on your cell phone. We get, we come under attack by bots almost daily at the Children's Health Defense, but you don't know who's orchestrating it. It's all kind of obscure and invisible. But here's what we do know is that the British intelligence agency, MI5, said publicly that they are treating people who are vaccine dissidents as terrorists. So they're going to MI5 made an announcement that they were going to release their cyber warfare techniques that were designed for controlling terrorism on people who were what they called anti-vax in foreign countries. Now, the CIA technically is not supposed to be spying on Americans in America. But the way that they get around that is they use the Five Eyes, which are the intelligence agencies from our top allied countries, to do the spying, and then they share the information with the CIA. So that's one way they can do it.
The commercial capture to help you sell a mattress is one thing. Gathering all this information, is it just for information for its own sake? Who are these people beholden to? What is their ultimate MO?
Well, the thing they may not have any. They may just, there may be no sinister motive at this moment in history. The problem is that once you put that power, once you give that power to a government, it will, and this is a solid rule, and any power that the government has, it will ultimately abuse to the maximum extent possible. And it will never give back voluntarily. And, the last rule is that nobody ever complied their way out of totalitarianism, so we're all going along with it. And we don't know. And if Edward Snowden had not come out, we would not know that any of this was going on, that our telephone calls are all being monitored, that our text messages and emails are all being monitored and stored in these big data centers in Utah, and that there's nothing that you do that is private anymore. And, until that moment, Americans assumed that the government was not spying on them. So now the question is, they may not be doing anything bad with it now, but, if at any moment that could change.
Well, there's probably more Ed Snowdens out there. I think that you also said that 90% of the people in these agencies are likely good people. I've said something similar. Probably most of the people are good people, but they're stuck in the system. You also said that in the 3 years since the pandemic, well, you write in the book that I reread this past week by Anthony Fauci, you said that Americans have had this naive idealism that makes them reluctant to believe that their government's COVID policies were grotesquely ill-conceived. I feel like people are waking up. That's from my position. Do you think people are becoming less naive since the pandemic, that they're being shaken away?
I think there's more skepticism particularly about the medical agencies, the public health agencies, that CDC lost a lot of credibility. Which is good because CDC doesn't deserve the credibility at this point. People should be skeptical, and we need to be skeptical to protect ourselves and our children. It's bad overall because, we really should be strengthening democratic institutions and strengthening public faith in democratic institutions. But the way you do that is by making those institutions trustworthy, not by lying to people. So, and until that happens, it's good for people to exercise skepticism and mistrust.
Well, when I reread the Fauci book, I couldn't understand how a man like that was so effective. It doesn't strike me as a particularly charismatic guy. Maybe he's charismatic. Where does he get the source of so much power? And Fauci resiliently going through all those things.
There's so many famous scientists at CDC, like William Thompson, at NIH, like Bernice Eddy, one of the most famous scientists, female scientists in American history, who discovered that there was a carcinogenic virus in the polio vaccines, a virus called SV40, simian virus 40. That was given to 100 million American kids of our generation, my generation, which now has 10 times the soft cancer rate of the previous generation. So we were given and she exposed it. And she was punished by that and essentially forced out of the agency. It's really a national scandal what happened to her. John Anthony Morris, the same thing with him. He revealed problems with the flu vaccine, and he was driven out of the agency. There are, and they, the locks are changed on their doors. They're forced out of their laboratories. Their telephones are taken away. This is what happens to people who interfere with the mercantile ambitions of the agencies of the corporations and industries that those corporations regulate. I mean, those agencies regulate. So if you do something that offends the pharmaceutical industry or interferes with its profit taking, you're going to be punished in those agencies. Conversely, the individuals who are reliably in the tank with the industry, who are carrying water for them, people like Anthony Fauci, are people who rise inexorably to the top and then remain there for generations. So, here you have a public official who's been there for 50 years, the highest paid official in the United States government, much higher paid than the President of the United States. And he's there for one reason, because he knows how to serve agency ambition. He's taken that agency that was the gold standard for scientific research and essentially abandoned the mission of trying to figure out why are Americans so sick, and adopted instead a new mission, which is to develop to be an incubator for pharmaceutical drugs for the agency. And when it develops those drugs at NIH and then farms them out to a pharma company, it gets to collect royalties. So NIH is collecting billions of dollars on the Moderna vaccine, which they developed. And people who work for Tony Fauci, 4 to 6 individuals who work for him, have margin rights for those patents, so that they will collect now $150,000 a year for life, and their children and heirs will collect that money as long as that vaccine is being sold. So you have an agency where that has these commercial benefits that have overwhelmed their regulatory functions. And if you're going to get $150,000 a year for life and you're the regulator, do you think you're really going to be regulating, or are you going to be promoting? They are promoters of pharmaceutical drugs. They're not regulators anymore.
We saw that with a story we did on a guy named Christopher Cole, who was an FDA official, who said precisely that. The media is supposed to be skeptical. I don't remember as a child, I grew up in the 90s, I don't remember if I saw it on television, but maybe you could tell me when it started with networks go to commercial break and it says, brought to you by Pfizer. Has that been happening for decades?
Well, a big change happened, James, in 1997, when FDA changed its policy and allowed direct-to-consumer advertising by pharmaceutical companies on TV. That was not allowed before. There are only 2 countries in the world that allow direct-to-consumer advertising on TV by pharmaceutical companies. That's New Zealand and the United States, and it's one of the reasons we take 3 to 4 times the pharmaceutical drugs as any other nation. So, we take, Americans on average are taking 4 pharmaceutical drugs, and Europeans are taking 1 or none. And we are the sickest population in the world. We have the highest chronic disease rate. We we spend more on healthcare. We've spent $4.3
What
trillion
changed in
on
97?
healthcare.
97. What was
97. Well, 97. They, FDA had been captured by the agency, by the industry, and so they and it changed the rule. And now, I had this experience with Roger Ailes one time, who was the founder of Fox News. And I knew Roger. When I was 19 years old, I had this odd relationship with him, where I spent 3 months in a tent with him in Africa, and he had just come off the Nixon campaign and the Merv Griffin show. He was a producer at that time. It was before he started Fox News, and we spent the summer together shooting this movie over there, or the TV show over there, and we became friends. And he was he's a very brilliant guy. He was very witty and funny, and he was a very loyal friend. So when he started Fox News, and I started seeing him as a kind of Darth Vader, that he was, that he was just destroying so much of the things that I cared about, about American culture. And I felt antithetical to all the things that he believed in, but we maintained a friendship. And he would put me on. I was the only environmentalist who was going on Fox News regularly. So he would make Sean Hannity put me on, and Neil Cavuto and Bill O'Reilly, and I was on Fox News all the time talking to their audience about environmental issues. And I went in 2014. Roger had a family member who had been vaccine injured, and and at that point I was working on a documentary. We co-produced a documentary about the links between vaccination and neurological injury. And he watched it along with several other executives there. And I said, "Can you help me? Can I go on the air and promote this?" And he brought me into his office and he said, "I can't do this for you." And he said, "This is like a red line for us." And he said, on average, 75% of the advertising revenues in the nightly news come from pharmaceutical companies. He said, on average, there's 22 advertising slots on the nightly news, and 17 of those are pharmaceutical companies. And he said, if one of my hosts, like Cavuto or Sean, allowed you on to talk about this issue, I would have to fire them. And if I didn't, I would get a call from Rupert Murdoch within 10 minutes. So that kind of opened my eyes about, the impossibility. Then I had many, many other experiences like that, where TV hosts would do. Jake Tapper I did in 2005 a Rolling Stone piece on mercury and vaccines, and Jake Tapper worked with me for 3 weeks shooting an exclusive documentary on this secret meeting that between CDC and all the pharmaceutical agency, or the pharmaceutical producers at WHO, where they had done their own studies that showed that vaccines were causing the autism epidemic, and they had a meeting to try to hide it from the American people. It was called the Simpsonwood Conference, and I did an article, a prize-winning article in Rolling Stone. Jake Tapper did an accompanying documentary not a documentary, but a segment, a long segment to document, that I gave him an exclusive. The night before it ran, it was scheduled to run, which was the day the Rolling Stone article came out. He called me, and he was completely discombobulated, and he said, corporate, meaning the corporate offices, just killed off that story. They said, we can't run it. He said, it's the first time corporate's ever interfered with my journalism, and I'm outraged. And then the next day I called him, and he wouldn't answer the phone. And then they aired instead a segment that said that vaccines are safe. It was just a propaganda segment. So I saw this again and again, how the industry, by not only uses the news shows as a platform to promote its products, but it was now dictating content in those newsrooms. And one of the things is, James, is the evening news is the ideal audience for pharmaceutical products because, as you know, kids don't watch TV anymore. They don't watch the evening news. The people who are watching those news shows are people who are my age, and these are the people who are taking all the pharmaceutical drugs. They're sort of, they're senior citizens who are all hooked on pharmaceutical drugs. So that is where all the pharma ads are going. And so, that's why you see at the end of every news brought to you by Pfizer, brought to you by Merck. And, what I've said is Anderson Cooper is getting $13 million a year salary. But if you actually look at the revenues, probably 70 or 80% of that is coming from Pfizer. So who is he really working for? Is he working for the public interest? I don't think so. And it's not that Pfizer is, writing his scripts and dictating stuff, but he knows where the boundaries are of what he can and cannot say. And if he does say the wrong thing, then there is a conversation that's going to take place, like there was with Jake Tapper.
Well, what media outlets do you admire journalistically? Like Elon Musk's Twitter is an example of one where people are in the comments posting about Pfizer officials. When we did our story, people were finding out the name of the guy and where he worked, and it was sort of a citizen run. But is there any media institutions that you do respect or admire journalistically?
Well, I would say the ones now that are, free of pharmaceutical, there's very few. And
which are they?
Well, I would say Epic Times is one. And by the way, I'm skeptical about any news source, so I double check everything.
Where do you get your news?
I get it from a whole lot of different sources, and I'm on a lot of different listservs. And, I read the scientific journals, and I read critical assessments of those journals, and so I'm on my cell phone for a couple of hours a day.
So you have to read between the lines.
Yeah, I read between the lines. But I'm used to that because my job is about reading science critically. I sue people. I sue all my lawsuits, almost without exception, involve scientific controversies. So when I sue Monsanto, there's a bunch of peer-reviewed publications that say that glyphosate, which is in the Roundup, causes kidney cancer and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And then there's some studies on the other side that say, we didn't find it. And when we went to court against Monsanto, I tried 3 cases against them. They had the top scientists in the world from Stanford, from Yale, from Harvard, coming in and saying glyphosate is safe, Roundup is safe. And then we had our own scientists from Harvard, Stanford, and Yale saying, no, it isn't. So that's why, when somebody says to me, trust the experts, I'm like, which expert? Because there's always experts on both sides. And, that's not science. And what the experts say is not science. What Tony Fauci says is not science. The CDC says is not science. Science is what you look and read in PubMed, in peer-reviewed publications, and even that you have to read critically because those guys, a lot of them are on the tape too.
Debbie Bernal was one of 2 Pfizer officials that came to me, and she went public in March with me on stage, and she communicated to me just how scared she was. There were bans outside of her home. She was terrified. Are you, going back to the fear issue, do you ever get scared that these government agencies, these pharmaceutical companies, are going to try to physically harm you or the people that you care about?
I don't get scared about it, and I don't worry about it, but I know I'm aware of it. I'm aware of that danger. But I'm not going to worry about that stuff. And I feel like, this is my country, and I have a kind of a duty to fight that kind of stuff. There was a generation in this country in 1776 that put their lives on the line. A lot of them died and put their fortunes on the line and their property and their reputations, their livelihood. in order to give us the constitutional rights that we now take for granted. And in 1 year, we saw so many of those constitutional rights just eviscerated, and we have to be willing to make the same kind of sacrifices they do. There's a lot worse things to me than dying, and one of those is having my kids grow up in America where they do not have the constitutional rights that I grew up with.
A lot of people expressed to me that we're past the point of no return, that there's sort of hopelessness. We're so divided in this country. You talked about this in your speech, in your announcement. The president, how do you stop that division?
I think that the way that you bring people together is by telling the truth to people and just being frank. And, my father succeeded in doing that, by being just brutally honest with people and telling people things they didn't want to know. My father, when he ran for president, had almost no chance of winning. He was going against an elected president of his own party. He had all of the institutions of the Democratic Party against him. He had the labor unions against him. He had the big city mayors, all of who had been with him 4 years earlier in 1960 when he ran his brother's campaign. He had the liberal media against him, including the New York Times, the Village Voice. He had the liberal Democratic clubs. Hollywood was against him because they were all with McCarthy. And even the New Deal people who he had brought into office were now all working for LBJ. And nobody wanted him to run for president, but he did. So he ran for moral reasons because he could not support the war. And so he could not support LBJ. But it allowed him to tell the truth. It freed the hopelessness of his campaign, freed him, liberated him to tell the truth. And he kept telling people things they didn't want to hear. And then, the last day of his life, he won the South Dakota primary and the California primary, the most rural state in our country and the most urban state. And the people who lined the railroad tracks, when we took his body from New York to Washington, D.C., there was 2 million people on those tracks, and they were every color. It was a cross section of America. It was white, black. It was Catholics, priests, and rabbis, and nuns, and military people and hippies. And so he was really able to unite the country by doing this experiment of just telling the truth to people. And I think, we need to do that, and we need to look for the values that we have in common rather than the issues that are driving us apart.
You told Yahoo News a couple years ago that you went through a spiritual revolution. You said you struggle with addiction. Tell me what that revolution was. What do you mean when you say spiritual revolution?
Well, I don't know if it was a revolution, that I call it a revolution. I had, like many people, a spiritual realignment. And that's really part of recovering from addiction. The whole 12-step program is based upon a sort of a structure for inducing a spiritual awakening or a spiritual realignment. Bill Wilson, who was the founder of AA, had a correspondence with Carl Jung, and Carl Jung had treated thousands and thousands of alcoholics and said they were hopeless, that they could not recover. When he was asked, has it ever happened, he said, only in rare cases where there's a complete spiritual realignment. And that's the only way that you can recover from alcoholism, that you can live without, that you can live a sober life.
They shouldn't really be speaking out against it. I noticed that the NAACP is urging African Americans
through a lot of, through many kind of paths, discovered a method for inducing spiritual awakenings, and through going through the 12 steps, and then also by helping other alcoholics, which is part of that.
How old were you when you...
I got sober when I was 28.
28. Do you think you can actually pull this off? Do you think you can win? Are you an optimist?
I do believe I can win, and our polling, our internal polling shows, is very, very
What is it right
optimistic.
now, as of this week?
Well, our internal polling shows me beating Trump 8 points. Well, I think because of my ability to attract independents and many Republicans, that I actually have probably a better chance of winning the election than any other Democratic candidate.
And you consider yourself an optimist, a
Yeah.
hopeful person.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I consider myself an optimist, but I try not to go into too much optimism or pessimism. And the way that I live my life is to not have expectations about the future. And I learned that, as an environmentalist, because when you're an environmentalist, if every victory that you have is temporary and every defeat you have is permanent, and you end up seeing a lot of stuff lost, which I did. Like, you see places that were sacred and beautiful being destroyed. You see species disappearing. You see things that are going wrong.
So it's like this too shall pass.
Well, a lot of environmentalists burn out because they get so crushed by these, and I just didn't want that to happen. So I said, I'm going to focus on my own conduct, and I really don't have any control over anything except for this little piece of real estate inside my own shoes. And God's in charge of the results, but I have to do my part, which is to get up every morning and say, reporting for duty, sir, and then going out to the front lines and fighting the battle. And if we win or lose, that's in God's hands, but I don't have expectations. So if we lose, I'm going to treat it the same way as if we win. And that, if you don't have expectations, you don't get disappointed, and you can't be beaten. Because no matter what happens, you're going to come back fighting. And that is what makes me relentless, because I don't have any expectation. No matter what they do to me, I'm going to get up and fight.
Last question. When you become the president, if you become the president, you're now governing the administrative state. You're in charge of these agencies. What things will you do? What things can you control when you get into that position?
I've spent 40 years studying these agencies. I have a PhD in how to unravel the corrupt corporate cultures that are dominating these agencies. When you litigate against the agency, you spend all your time thinking about how do they get this way. And who is it? There's so many good people working. Why are they working so dysfunctionally? And, I know the people in many of these agencies that have to be moved. I know how to change the corporate culture. And I really, in that little twilight zone before you fall asleep every night, I'm thinking about what I'm going to do in the first weeks when I get into office about fixing these agencies, one at a time. I don't, that's something I'm excited about.
You won't say what that is because you don't want to give your cards away. Show your cards to them.
Well, I mean, I could actually sit down and give you details, but it would be a long conversation.
Yes. Well, all right. Well, thank you very much. To be continued, and wish you the best.
Thank you very much, James. Thanks for having me.